Hi everyone, welcome along to DigiShift 68. We're talking today about using technology to promote access to justice. I'm really interested in this one. So we're talking about the intersection of technology and justice and how technology can increase access to legal services for marginalised communities. We've got three really good speakers today. We've got people working in the third sector, we've got people working in human rights, we've got people working in the startup space as well. And I'm hoping there's going to be a lot of lessons learned from today, not just from the speakers in the room, but also people in the room who are joining us sharing their own experiences. And actually, how do we democratise access to justice using digital tools? So we're going to hear from Aaliya first of all. Aaliya is the Chief Executive of Legal Services Agency. Some of you might know them as LSA, an organisation that's embracing digital as a tool to democratise access to legal advice and support. Aaliya has worked for over 18 years in the voluntary sector, working with organisations like Citizens Advice Scotland and the Ethnic Minorities Law Centre as well. So I'm going to hand over to Aaliya just now.
Thanks very much, Ross, and good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be able to share not only experience within LSA, but as Ross has highlighted sort of previously within the wider voluntary sector. And just reflecting on sort of looking at digital and access to justice. I was just thinking, we start our day and there's so much that we rely on in terms of digital. You're checking the weather, you're checking your commute. For me personally, I'm making sure that my mum sent me a good morning message. She's overseas, it lets me know that she's all right. And if I don't hear from her, then she'll get questions as to, is your phone not charged? What's happened? So we rely so much on digital technology. And I think in terms of access to justice, probably the pedal has accelerated in the last few years. I think prior to that, it's probably safe to say that within the legal sector, perhaps digital innovation was maybe not where it needed to be. But really glad to see that when push came to shove, that actually we made the impossible possible. So that's some of the things that I wanted to share today. Just very briefly, an introduction to LSA. We are a national law centre based in Glasgow and have been operating for 33 years this year. We specialise in areas of what I call social welfare law. So we have a housing and general court department that focuses on preventing homelessness, addressing unsuitable accommodation. Within that, we also deal with welfare benefits and appeals and working with third sector partners. And we have criminal injuries compensation. And during the pandemic, we also re-established our employment law service. Our other department, the mental health department, deals with financial guardianships, power of attorneys, mental health detention. And we also have legal education, which is providing seminars and training. So I wanted to give you that little breadth of the work that we do. And a lot of people who access our services are facing multiple deprivations. I think that's really important in terms of who it is that we provide a service to and what advancement in digital technology has allowed us to do. So just thinking back to two different elements, I think there's probably, I think you could safely say that we were very, very heavily paper-based. And in terms of sort of changing our ways of working in the pandemic, we really needed to make sure that if we've got a case management system, that we are using it as effectively as we can. And again, it was very much, it's a face-to-face service. How are we going to be able to provide a service to people when the office is closed? And I'm very, very pleased to say that, in a snapshot, yep, we made it happen. We used our case management system a lot more effectively. And we made sure that people could contact us by telephone, by video conferencing, by introducing web chat, getting through to us by email. And I think that flexibility, I would say, has to be the most important thing when you are looking at developing digital technologies and using those to make sure that everybody can access the systems. The reason I mentioned our case management system is, for me, the two things go hand in hand. Apologies, my cat's decided that it's interested in what is happening. I think internal efficiencies have a great role to play in terms of how many people you are able to support. And I think, you know, in terms of those, sorry, I can't see what I'm doing. In terms of those efficiencies, I think the importance of those, and I think, again, it's sort of about feeling comfortable to have those conversations within the organisation of change and why that change is being introduced. So if you can introduce systems that make it efficient and save your staff time, you're actually increasing the time that you are committing to be able to support people. And within communities, and particularly marginalised communities, which I see as one of the areas of focus for today's discussion, we've just gone through dealing with the most unusual circumstances that everyone experienced through the pandemic. We've come out of that to a cost of living crisis. So people who were already dealing with one crisis after another, actually, that's magnified. And also the number of people that have been affected has also increased. So we've not necessarily increased the number of people that are advising, but we have increased the number of people seeking advice. And I think it's really important that whether it is organisations that are introducing systems that make it more accessible for people to be able to use the service, whether it's through an organisation and or tools that people can get to be able to use services themselves, I think those two have to go hand in hand. There will always be people who actually need to speak to an advisor, but there will be people who can go away and do things themselves. So what has sort of some of the changes that we've made, what has that allowed us to do? So much that it's really difficult to put that down in a few minutes, but we've been able to, geography is no longer an issue for us. We're based in Glasgow. That's where our head office is. We've got an office in Greenock, but we've been able to advise clients in Shetlands. We've been able to represent them in hearings. Remote hearings have been a key role in terms of how people have been accessing courts and tribunals. And it's probably a conversation for another day, but I think there's pros and cons in relation to both. So it's really important that people are able to access advice, and then they do have representation at these hearings, whether it be by telephone or video. It's equally important to be able to put forward where actually that creates possibilities, but where there are also limitations. So we've been able to use the information and evidence that we've been gathering to be able to say whether what we think in terms of access to justice and hearings in courts and tribunals, what impact that has for individuals. Procedural hearings are a totally different matter, but where it's a full hearing, that's a totally different matter of whether it's being conducted by remote means or not. And also where there are avenues that you can actually advise people where they haven't sought legal representation in advance. So we have, for example, a help desk that operates in Glasgow Sheriff Court where somebody's got a hearing and they don't have representation, then we can advise them and represent them on the day. That has limitations in terms of how that would happen if it was in a remote setting. But I use the word limitations very deliberately. It isn't to say that it is impossible, but the systems within the justice sector need to work together for that to happen. I'll sort of sum up with a few things that both I have seen in LSA, but also things that are happening wider within the legal sector, and really welcome what my colleagues in the panel speaker have to say, but also everybody on the call, because there's some developments that I think that we really need to do more of, some that we may not already be aware of. So I know from a lot of people, particularly in what I term as the third sector legal sector, which is voluntary organisations, it's law centres, it's citizens advice bureaus, it's many advice organisations. What have they done to be able to use the lessons from the pandemic in a positive way? So it's not unusual for us to hear about people coming to the organisation with bags and bags of documents. So I was really interested to hear of an organisation that had set up sort of a pilot about virtual bag sifting, and that was essentially that they were able to scan all of the information that came through, be able to put it in some kind of a logical order in terms of content. So that meant that the solicitor who was dealing with it, or the advisor, could look at the contents and sort of focus in on what were relevant aspects. So I thought that was a really good way of doing things. We also, and this is something that particularly we can speak to from experience in LSA, for some people they are very anxious, and for that reason actually a remote means of being able to contact you probably works better for them until that trust and rapport is developed. Do I feel that digital is replacing face-to-face? Absolutely not. But I think digital does definitely create avenues and provide more flexibilities for you to be able to see that client who may be in the Shetlands or in Skye or Dumfries and Galloway, anywhere in the country. And or if somebody has moved, someone very correctly reminded me when we were sort of getting some thoughts together that we actually have a client who's moved to Australia, but we are still able to represent them. I think what we also found, so for example, very quickly, we put web chat on our website for the very first time, that we actually had some clients who maybe contacted us initially through web chat, went on to telephone advice or video or in person when we were able to do so, but then still used web chat to get in touch with us. So it created those efficiencies in terms of staff time being directed where it was most effective. Also, I think I remember when I first started, so I started in LSA in December of 2019, just shortly before the pandemic. And I remember in January saying, oh, we should be looking at doing webinars as part of our legal education. And, you know, the response was, not too sure if people will be interested in webinars. And obviously, come March, we did need to change how we delivered. And I'm pleased to say, you know, April, we delivered our very first webinar addressing the pandemic. We had over 100 people booked in no time. And now we can see the real shift that more people want to be attending either remote sessions like the one that we have today. It provides that flexibility, or, you know, hybrid. We're seeing less and less of where people want purely face-to-face. So I think there's so much that technology has to offer. I think the key thing I would say is that flexibility needs to be the driver. It will not suit everybody. And the final point that I would make is, with a particular focus on marginalised communities, so we do have to recognise that there are people that need to get advice who will not have the technology, who will not have perhaps the skills or perhaps the confidence. Two main points that I would say from that is, I think we do still make a presumption of what we think people can and can't do. And I think we need to overcome that. And the other thing I would say where I think it has worked remarkably well is there's so many people within the sector, community organisations, local authorities, libraries. There's so many people that you can tap into where working in collaboration can make that digital access to advice provision happen. In doing so, we need to make sure that those organisations are properly resourced and that we as a network are connected. And I'll just sort of end with addressing the point that I made about assumption. So I remember a few years ago, my brother had got in touch with me to say, Mum can't figure out how to use her, she needs to check her sugar every morning before she has her breakfast so she knows what amount of medicine she needs to take. She's diabetic. He said, in moving, she's forgot the instructions. It's a new device that she's using. Can you give her a call and can you talk her through what she needs to do? I was out and about, so I said to him, I would probably be 20 minutes or half an hour most, but I'd give her a call if he could just let her know. So I get home, FaceTime my mum so that I can see the device, and she's sitting there eating breakfast, and I'm like, what are you doing? And she's like, having my breakfast. And it's like, but why? Like, because I'm hungry. It's like, but you've not checked your sugar level in your medicine, da 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 da. And she's like, I had the box. I looked up the name. I Googled it. It took me to a YouTube video. I've watched it. I know what I'm doing. So I'm good. So the reason I give that example is there is so much that technology can help in terms of people being able to access the information that they need to then be able to make informed decisions. So I hope that's been useful. Really interested to hear what my colleagues have to say, and really interested to hear what questions you have and what experiences that you can share with me. Thanks very much, Rose.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ali. That was excellent. Thank you. There's some questions coming through in the chat, but do please, if you've got any other ones, put them in the chat. John and I'll pick those up. I'm going to hand over just now to Danae Shell. Danae is the CEO and co-founder of Valla, which is a startup dedicated to providing accessible and affordable legal support to people across the UK and I think globally, but I will check that, and that's maybe a question actually we can chat a wee bit about. Danae's got 17 years plus experience in Scotland's startup community, and for me, I think is probably where I think there's that nice cross section between some of the work that startups are doing and some of the work that that charities are doing, and actually Danae's startup probably treating the charity sector with respect in a way that some startups don't always treat the charity sector with respect. So I'm really interested to hear a wee bit more about Valla, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions after Danae's piece as well.
Awesome, thank you so much. I do have a few slides I can share, so let me just quickly share my screen. Give me a thumbs up if you can see that okay. Awesome. Yeah, I want to give you a little bit of context. Basically, like everything Aaliya said, I could not agree with more, and you'll hear some of those points coming up again. So I came into the whole access to justice space as a consumer, as a woman in tech who was seeing a lot of problems with discrimination at work and with people being kind of forced out of their jobs and wondering why nobody could do anything about it, and then came to realize nobody could afford to do anything about it. And that is why, you know, this is when I'm explaining it to people outside of the sector, that is why we exist. Like, you take somebody on an average UK salary, if they exit a company and they're looking for a settlement, you know, just 2 months settlement, something like that, it's going to cost more for a law firm to hunt down that money for them than they would actually be able to get back. Like, the amount of employment lawyers I speak to, and they say, you know, we just have to turn away so many people because it's just not worth it. That's the phrase I hear over and over. And I often say, you know, we help people with like £200 problems, £2,000 problems instead of £20,000 problems or £200,000 problems. And this is a good example of that. And what we do is we have shifted, using technology, the options for people so that they can self-represent and hopefully spend a much smaller, like our target is 90% of the cost of a law firm by shifting the work through technology. And the reason that we kind of think about it this way is because I came from the online accounting industry. So I worked at Free Agent, which is a kind of Scottish success story, and You probably know their biggest competitor better, and Xero. And when you were talking, Aaliya, about the paper in the bags, that's when I first started working in accounting. That's what accounting was. You rock up with like a Tesco bag full of receipts, and then you hand it all over, and then you wait for a few weeks, and then this magic document comes back, and it's like a big black box, right? It was this impenetrable, expensive service. Whereas now, taxi drivers, hairdressers, they do their taxes and they do their accounts on their phone. And then they get a professional to check it for them. And that is the model that we are using here in the law. And so the technology that we have developed and the way that we're thinking about this is essentially building a self-representation platform for consumers. And we also are building a dashboard on top for the charities that support consumers. And, essentially from a legal perspective, we've built a case management system for consumers. And I've got a quick screenshot I can show you later. But then we know that human element is so important. We know that checking is so important. You probably want to get an accountant to check your VAT return or your self-assessment return. So it's the same kind of thing. So then we've essentially built the platform to then make it easy for those professionals to check, just like Aaliya was talking about, where it's, it's not a big Tesco bag full of documents anymore. It is a tidy, it's the equivalent of a reconciled set of books. That is the vision that I tell the team and that I tell everyone else. I'm like, this is what it needs to be. It needs to be as simple as an accountant checking a reconciled set of books. And if you think about in the legal terms and the legal industry terms, what that is it's unbundling. We are unbundling legal services, allowing the client plus technology to take over a lot of the administrative work and even some of the legal thinking, if that's all that they can afford, and then leaving it only for the professionals to have to do the most specific legal work possible. And so, as an example, if someone was unfairly dismissed, they can use our platform for free to collect evidence, to understand what their claim would be, and to start to build out the events that support that claim and attach documents to that. Then we have templates built in so that they can then generate the documents. That particular tribunal claim also has a peace of mind check built into it, where a professional looks at your document and double checks it makes sense. And then we have these on top services. So say, you're moving through the tribunal process, you've got a preliminary hearing coming up, and you just want a bit of extra support just for that. Then, that's all you pay for. It's a fixed price kind of ad hoc service on top. And here's a little screenshot of what that case management platform looks like. We've essentially kind of taken a look at what case management platforms are for lawyers, and then we've looked at all the problems that consumers have, and we've kind of blended that together into something that a consumer can use to make sense of what's going on, to record what's been happening. We're now using some AI. We already have the functionality where you can just forward in the emails and it automatically updates uploads the documents. Because I'm showing a desktop version here, but 60% of our users use Valla on mobile. So most of the time, the easiest way to get documents in is to just forward to a special email address. And we're now using AI to auto-categorize and basically do e-discovery on those documents as well. The other thing that I thought might be useful, it just showed a little bit of our numbers, but the other thing I thought might be interesting to talk about is how people find us, because again, this is very technologically focused. The biggest group of people who come to Valla every day are coming from TikTok. Because we post a ton of educational content on TikTok, everything from wage theft to what is interim relief, to talking about bullying at work. A lot of people come to us from SEO as well with the same kind of content. But in terms of meeting the users where they are, we're really finding that social media makes a lot of sense. A lot of my time is actually on TikTok Live, just answering questions for people, helping them to try and diagnose what's happening to them, and then pointing them to, ACAS early conciliation, pointing them to the free resource that they need, or a service or a template like ours. And the most important thing is that, people are able to do this. The people who are able to do this are able to do this is probably the best way of putting it. And so, just thinking about what Aaliya was talking about there before, we have a lot of users who have particular disabilities or particular language difficulties and things like that. Some people get support from a friend or a family. We're able to provide some support internally as well. And we've partnered with a few charities who are now using the platform to extend their reach, because they're able to support people either to use the platform, or they're able to ask the user to, upload some basic information so that they can use it as that central point. And we're actually looking for another pilot partner right now, if anyone is interested in trying out the platform for free to see if it can amplify their reach. So yeah, if you are interested in any of that, that's my email address. But yeah, that is a whistle-stop tour of kind of how we're thinking about and how we're actively using technology to address at least part of this problem. It's, if you think about it, 80% of the market can't afford a law firm. We can't, with the platform that we have today, we're not going to be able to support the people with the biggest language needs, with the biggest affordability needs, but we are able to cover a huge swathe of the market that can't go to £5,000, but do have good access to technology, good English, and can afford a £100 template, for example. So yeah, that's a little overview, and I'm so excited to get to the discussion part.
Thanks, Danae, that's great. Okay, our final speaker is Jen Ang, and Jen is Director at Just Right Scotland and the social enterprise JRS Know-How. She's going to be talking about their Follow It app and some other initiatives that have helped people use digital to exercise their rights more effectively. And we'll pop some of those links in the chat box as well, just so that everyone's got those. So I'll hand over to Jen just now. Do remember, pop your questions in the chat box, and then we'll get a chance for discussion after we hear from Jen.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ross. And I really enjoyed listening to Aaliya and Danae. I'm a huge fan of LSA and Valla. So I am going to try and stick to my 5 minutes so that we can get to the interesting chat part. So Just Right Scotland, and a number of you will know, is a law centre much like LSA. I'm all branded today, so you can tell that we defend and extend people's rights. What I'll say is that we're human rights lawyers, and we do work across a wide range of human rights, actually. And we're in this space. Why? Well, it wasn't a natural or immediate move, to be honest. But for us, we understood that a key part of access to justice is empowering people. And we understood that there are massive gaps in people understanding their rights, and that digital tools are one way of reaching people. They're not the only way. And just like LSA, our kind of legal advice delivery model is very heavily dependent actually on reaching out to hard to reach communities and being on the ground. So we understand that the audience for some of our work is a limited audience, and yet it's one that we're not reaching. So if it is effective, and we evaluate the effectiveness of what we're doing when we spend time on these sorts of projects, if it's effective, then we'll step into the space. So I'm just going to share 2 case studies today, 2 very different uses of digital by our teams. The first was led by JRS Know-How, which is our social enterprise that does work around digital information and outreach around human rights and equalities issues. And the second was led by the Scottish Women's Rights Centre, which is one of our legal advice delivery centres, and that's looking at better outcomes for victim survivors of stalking. So let's look at protest first, which was a kind of a shorter sort of one-off project, but it was very much in the context of sort of the political challenges that we were facing. Amnesty Scotland came to us because they were looking to develop some public legal education around the right to protest in Scotland. And this was linked to the COP26 event that happened in 2021 in Glasgow. What it meant is that tens of thousands of people were going to come to Glasgow, and we anticipated might be interacting with our criminal justice system because they would be protesting, and that there's very little public information about the right to protest in Scotland, which is different to the right to protest in other parts of the UK. When we looked at what was publicly available, we realized that lawyers being lawyers, basically what's available is full of jargon, explanations aren't clear or practical. And there are not many lawyers in Scotland that practice exclusively in this area. And that actually it's really difficult to advise in this area because the law changes all the time and there are tensions in how rights are interpreted, meaning it's quite hard to agree definitively what you should put in an information resource if you're doing this. We said we would have a go, and it had this very practical, and urgent timeline about providing something that was going to be very accessible, but also legally correct. And we did that in the form of a website with sort of updatable modules. We included a facility for people to, so there's a kind of FAQ. We included a facility for people to ask additional questions that we have tried to answer as we go. And we included a glossary. So this is one example of simply providing information and then the means for people then to access further resources or to onward refer, but it's very static in the sense that it had to be done to a particular timeline with a particular budget and in a particular way. Some of the, this is still available online and we're looking at doing updates because that protest has actually continued to rise in the public consciousness as something of importance. And what's been really interesting for us, at least, has also been that we're now getting kind of continuous feedback from people who access the resource saying, can you provide this? Can you provide that? What we learned is that sometimes the simplest solution, a website, is the best. But you do also remember to think about your values and understand that there are barriers, there are kind of sort of lots of things to overcome in taking this approach. The second thing I want to share quickly is a solution or a product that was delivered to address a problem with stalking and prosecution for stalking basically across the UK. And as I said, this was led by our Scottish Women's Rights Centre. So the problem with stalking is that this is there is an offence on the books, but there are very low levels of convictions. And the definition is quite broad. Stalking and harassment is unwanted focused behaviours carried out by one person or persons against another, causing fear or alarm. And you need to demonstrate a course of conduct, which just means 2 or more incidents. But you will appreciate that when people experience stalking and harassment, they don't have that legal definition in mind. And the issue is that there are a huge range of things that could happen that would satisfy that course of conduct definition. And there's what we commonly think of, which is following people, surveillance, standing too close, humiliation in public. But it also includes things like planting spyware on people's computers, repeatedly texting, interfering with your post. And it includes actions against or by other people, like attempts to take your children away, befriending your family or friends, damaging your property, threatening your pets, all of these things. There's a long list. As a result, although 1 in 5 women in the UK experience stalking, which is a strikingly high figure, it is massively underreported. And even if you were determined to do something about it, most victim survivors of stalking who first access legal advice, and that was kind of that's the issue that we identified because we provide that legal advice. Most victim survivors of stalking don't have the right kind of evidence to establish that course of conduct because that's not what they were thinking about before they came to get the advice. And they needed a safe way to keep a record. So often lawyers would advise you to write this down in a notebook or something like that. And that form of recording is not as secure as perhaps a secure app on your phone. Okay. So the Scottish Women's Rights Centre in 2019 actually developed this app called the Follow It app and also launched it with information materials about stalking, addressing that first barrier, as I said, about knowing your rights. Broadly, how it works, you can kind of guess, is that it allows you to record incidents either at the time they happen. So with geolocation, if you turn it on and your phone details, you can actually press go. And at that time, it starts to record that this is happening in this place at this time. It allows you to, but you don't have to, record the kind of thing that has happened. Is it receiving an email? Is it a face-to-face contact, for example? It allows you to record, it prompts you to record how you feel. Legally, it's quite important that you record how you feel at the time an incident occurs. Again, that's something that's quite hard to recall afterwards, although you can do this recording after something has happened. It doesn't have to be contemporaneous. And crucially, you can see the value of this. It allows you to add a photo or a video as it's happened, and actually to store that away and then to stop thinking about it. There are lots of optional questions, and as I said, you can go back in and edit it afterwards. What I haven't done the screenshots for, because time not permitting, is that the app also includes, as you can see at the bottom, buttons for support. You can actually make a report through the app, both to the police, or you can access support from an advocacy or legal worker at the time. In order for a woman to have access to the app, we do a training session with her first. So it's a pretty high level of user understanding at that stage, so that they know how to safely access it. In terms of sort of wrapping up in reflections, I suppose what I would say is that we have given you two very different approaches to using tech to increase access to justice. One is a bit more kind of broad and public and passive, the right to protest work. The other is very specific and individual. To follow it app requires us to engage with you before you use it, but you can see that there, because we're piloting it, there are safety reasons why we really wanted to do that in order to monitor what's happening. And then drawing back and thinking about my reflections in light of what my colleagues have shared, I would say there are two things. One is that there is a cost to maintaining legally accurate advice like tech. And if you can cover that cost by monetizing this, which is a really good thing to do, that's helpful. But if you're a charity thinking about putting up information and then maintaining it, you need to cost that in. And because there is nothing worse than incorrect legal information in one of these tools, and everything changes all the time. The second thing that I would say is that I'd love for us to have a conversation both about what user groups and kind of what applications this kind of tech is really useful for, but also, hello, Aaliya's cat. I love this cat. If she turns to the screen, it's amazing. But also a conversation about who's left out. So how do you prep your user to get the best out of your tools, but also how do we make sure that these solutions run alongside continued funding and support for the face-to-face or the one-to-one that goes with that work? Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. That was really great. And thanks, Jen, for squeezing in a lot in a short space of time at the end there. I'm sure we're going to get loads of questions. While folk are thinking about questions, what I've seen in chat is I think there was one from Chris for, there were a few from you, Chris, that's great. But I think the first one he had was about any unintended consequences of the increased use of tech by LSA. So I suppose you mean something unintended or unexpected. Aaliya, I don't know if you wanted to pick that one up.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think in terms of unintended consequences, I suppose two, three things come to mind. One is in terms of the geographical spread, actually, I don't think we started off thinking we would be able to, we would be contacted by people as far as Shetlands or Skye. But I think what that did give us was the opportunity for collaboration, but also thinking about resource. So digital technology allows you for people to be able to get in touch with you. And I think flexibility, I think I'd mentioned, was key. So working with partners, you can look at different mediums. I think where the limitations in terms of those unintended consequences can be, where actually you do need to attend in-person court hearings, and the distance and the resource being such that you actually can't commit. And it can be difficult to take somebody's case on and then say, I'm only going to do it until this much. So I think resource implications in terms of that unintended consequence, I would say, is one, but it also allowed us to gather evidence to see what further developments needed to be made to allow us to sort of really be able to make the most of technology. I think the other unintended consequence, which again made us think more about internal things, was how can we streamline things and how can we make things easier for partners. And sometimes it is literally those simple solutions that don't really require a lot of either resource implication and or sort of human, both financial as well as human resource implications. So for example, introducing a page on our website about how to make an appointment, whether it be for individuals or partners. So sort of looking at what are those efficiencies that you can make, so that people are not having to say, right, what is it that you want me to prioritize because we've got far too much by way of volume, then being able to deal with it. So, you know, being able to sort of think about what you can do that are simple steps that you can take that would still allow you to achieve your objective.
Thanks very much. I don't know if other speakers wanted to pick up on that theme at all about unintended consequences or kind of new possibilities that opened up through use of tech, before we go on to another question.
I think the one thing I'd add is the number of disabled people who are working with us. We had a non-verbal autistic person who recently worked with us at Valla, and it was because people know that we support disabled people. They're very good at asking for adjustments, and some of those adjustments are very easy to do digitally. And I thought about it at the surface level, but coming up against very specific use cases has been super enlightening. For example, we don't have a call with certain users. Instead, we do everything over email, or vice versa, if they're dyslexic, for example. And we have a employment tribunal support group webinar every month, and usually get 100 to 200 people signing up for that, and have a lot of accommodations in that support group as well. We go into breakout rooms, and some people, again, verbal, some people just want to sit and listen, some people are too anxious to participate. And so I think being able to, it surprised me how much we were able to accommodate so many different needs to help people get the kind of either community that they were looking for, the support that they were looking for. That's been very welcome.
Thanks very much. And
And I
Jen,
got-
did you want to chip in on that?
Yeah, I think I would just add, something that as Aaliya outlined, I think that to some extent legal advice providers stepped into this space unexpectedly because of the COVID pandemic. And I would add that something that is really interesting and exciting about working in this space is that you are trying something new. So we spend our whole lives as lawyers, advising people face to face in a particular way. And suddenly we had to think about both the opportunity, but also safeguarding challenges that we did not anticipate in working in a different way. But with the feedback, one thing I've noticed is that if we have the resource to do it, we are giving people more and better choices. So in terms of taking legal advice, but also attending courts, as Aaliya pointed out, this is a very live issue. What courts and tribunals will allow a digital process and which ones are reverting to face-to-face. I think we're offering people choice, and from a human rights-based perspective, I think our mission now is to maintain as much choice for people as the system can sustain. And that speaks to Danae's point about working with people with disability, but also people who have experienced complex trauma rightly have the right to have different reactions to that. Some want to be there in person. Some people find it much easier to have the physical distance of a screen. Some people do not physically want to be in the space that their perpetrator's in, and that's entirely understandable. So I know it takes more time and resource, but I think my plea would be, can we be as open-minded as possible, as long as possible, to offer the benefits or the choice to people where we can.
Thanks very much. If I may, a little kind of follow up on that one to kind of all of you, I guess, is I'm no legal expert at all, but it strikes me that legal systems can be quite conservative on there's procedures and processes that are followed. I suppose I'm thinking about if I as an individual was involved in a legal process, mistakes for me are quite bad if something goes wrong. So that to me makes it feel quite difficult to do test and learn, because obviously in the digital space we often talk about, try out new stuff, have an experiment, see if it works or not. And I suppose I would think if I was there with my own case on the line, I'd maybe be thinking, oh, there's a new thing which might have some question marks over it, or there's the kind of the standard process. And I suppose, how do you approach that? And I guess it's a question about what the system makes of it, because as you said, I think the system sometimes isn't so open to new processes, and then also how individual people seeking and taking advice, you know, what does it feel like for them if they're working in a new way, and how you give some reassurance there.
So I'll make a start, a dab at the start of answering that question, John, and you raise a number of really important points. I'll start with maybe what Jen said about, you know, the legal sector didn't start off with thinking that we could use digital advancements in terms of providing advice and or actually conducting hearings and representation. So it definitely did not start that way. And what the pandemic taught us, as hard as it was actually nothing is impossible. And I think in terms of the choice also element that Jen rightly highlights, because quite often in terms of providing that evidence, your particular circumstances of not only what the case is about, but also your particular circumstances of what else you might be dealing with. And again, you know, people that come to us don't come to us with a nice, neat single issue. They come to us with multiple issues, and the consequences, as you highlight, John, can be quite severe. It could be that somebody's going to lose the roof over their heads. It could be that, you know, they're going to lose their job and not be able to meet their finances. It could be that they may be removed from the country. So the consequences are pretty severe. And I think the element of choice, I really liked what, you know, Jen highlighted in terms of that choice, because you need to create as comfortable of an atmosphere and circumstances to allow that individual to fully engage with the system. And accessing sort of the justice system is not straightforward. So I think flexibility really needs to be something that is a driver. Flexibility from people that are providing advice, flexibility from courts, tribunals. That really is, and what do I mean by flexibility? What I mean is that there should be means if somebody is able to send you something using tech. So, and it can make a difference in terms of night and day. So if you're dealing with somebody who's on the telephone, but you actually need to see the paperwork that they've sent, explore what they can use that does still have those sort of security issues that you can address. But, you know, can they take a photo? Can they WhatsApp it to you? Do you have the means to receive it by WhatsApp? Simple solutions. Can they go somewhere where they may be able to scan the information through to you? In terms of hearings, is the court equipped to be able to deal with sort of multiple ways of how a hearing might be conducted? Is a remote hearing the best thing for that individual case? Where it might be that it does need to be a face-to-face hearing. Is it all face-to-face? You know, if you've got an interpreter who's dialing in, then it's not exactly face-to-face. So I think sort of just thinking about all of those things. And the reason I use the example of an interpreter is quite often an interpreter might be doing simultaneous interpreting. That is not possible in a remote medium. So I think just sort of, it does need a little bit of thought process. It does need a little bit of planning. But I don't think anything is impossible. And we do need to sort of look at, if we are using tech and embracing where the direction of things are going, that we are taking that user input. So a lot of courts and tribunals are moving their systems online. But the important thing I would say here is that's really good. I can remember where, you know, you were working with a 10 working day deadline to lodge an appeal, and it had to be served. So, you know, we were lucky we were in Glasgow. Either, you know, one member of the team would run down to the court and lodge it now, and then you moved on to faxes where you sat there and held one paper after the other to make sure that the whole bundle went through, and now you can email it. So there's definitely things that are moving in the right direction to provide that flexibility, that choice, that comfort to the individual to try and create systems that support individuals that meet their needs.
Thanks very much. I don't know, Danae, if you want to chip in at all on that one.
There's a founder in another company in Edinburgh, and she said, you know, if someone's hair is on fire, they'll use anything to put out the fire, even a brick. And
Yes.
her product used to be a brick, and she said, but you know, people still used it because it was the only thing that could put out the fire, and then it got better, and it wasn't a brick anymore. And I always think about that when I think about like, you know, how we balance the kind of good enough iterative approach in tech with the very real life consequences of what we're helping people with. And what I've been doing a lot is letting the users guide me. And, you know, because we've been so hands-on with Valla, and we, you know, I'm still talking to a lot of the users. And if I have like a new idea, or if I want to try something, I will say to them, you know, first, I'm not going to do it with someone who's in a very vulnerable position. But if I think, you know, you're working with someone who has that capacity, then I'll say, you know, would you like to try something new with me? And the capacity that people have for experimentation when their hair is on fire is quite high. And some of those experiments have failed, and some of those experiments have worked beautifully. But what I've found is that we've really, like, we've not just built a platform, we've built a community of people who don't just hate what they're going through, but hate that other people are going through it as well. And they are incredibly creative and trying to figure out how to solve their own problem with the very limited means that they have. And they're incredibly generous in figuring out how that could be expanded to support other people. And so it has been, like, we've always tried to err on the side of caution here, even within the confines of a tech company. But what I'm finding is often the users are pulling me towards more experimentation than I might have initially thought, because their hair is on fire, basically.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We're getting towards the end of time though now. I think there's probably time for like maybe one or maybe even two more questions if folk are keen. I'm gonna cheekily ask another question while we're waiting. Oh, one's popped in. Brilliant, Laura, thank you. So Laura, do you want to read out your question, or do you want me to do that for you just till we've got it?
Thanks, John. Just any reflections on artificial intelligence, any opportunities and harm to avoid? A couple of the tech tools we've talked about today, whether it's chatbots, or I think that Valla has a little bit of artificial intelligence baked into the design. Any reflections on that would be lovely. Thank you.
I can start on that one. Yeah, I think so it's fascinating seeing how large language models in particular are giving people access to, I think one of them, giving people access to tools they didn't have before. And when ChatGPT in particular launched, you know, I think before, the AI and ethics conversation was around who is training the models, right? And so for us, one of the things that we focus on is when we train a model, we are making sure that the people who are training the model reflect the people who are going to be using the model, so that we're not getting a mismatch between the training and the output, because often that's how you accidentally build internal biases into a model. With LLMs and the ChatGPT stuff, I think it's really interesting hearing my users talking about ChatGPT, because they often use it to send like professional letters and get wording that they need, especially if they English is their second language. And so that's how we're thinking about it as well, is, you know, one of the applications that I think is really interesting for LLMs in a closed environment. We just got access to some of the Amazon LLMs where you can keep all the training data and keep all the information within your own closed model instead of feeding it back out into something like ChatGPT, is basically someone saying something in their own words and then being able to translate that into something much more legal or something that fits, is expanded out or something along those lines. That's where I think this is super interesting, is again meeting people where they are, asking them to use their own words, their own language, and then being able to turn that into something that matches the expectations of a tribunal or the respondent or something like that. So I think we need to be super careful. For example, we're not going to be feeding any of our data into an open ChatGPT model, but where you can create these kind of closed off models, I think there's a lot of power there.
Thank you.
I'll come in really quickly, John, because I can see the time. And of course, Laura's asked a question that we could spend another 3 hours talking about. But I think I would say I'm really, really interested in the nexus between human rights frameworks and a human rights-based approach and AI. It's something so much so that I've been listening to AI podcasts recently, because I think that everyone, but particularly the charity sector and the social justice sector, needs to understand what's happening, because I don't think we do. And I would say I've come to 2 conclusions. One is that this is new technology, but like all technology, there's a really important role for experts and for leaning on everything that you know about risk and safeguarding, while also exploring the opportunities. So I'm not talking about the evidence that goes in, but actually, even when we can make huge advances for people by having more user-friendly interfaces for them to ask questions, even when we can make massive cost savings, because you don't need lawyers to do repetitive tasks, that actually a machine can do. You're going to need someone with the expertise to be shaping and checking the content, the decision making, and really quality assuring the outcome. Because as Danae said, this is, we're piloting in areas where there are significant rights at stake. And actually, I think you need the experts to tell you whether this is an area that's really suitable. And I think employment is. I think Valla's project is amazing. Or where it's going to be years before it's suitable, like, a representation in a domestic violence claim. Like, that's never going to be something that you allow a machine to do, not for some time. So that's the first thing, is remember the role of experts. And then the second thing I would say very quickly, because I saw a question there about audio recording in the courts, is that it occurs to me, I did not appreciate what AI technology could do with digital data like audio and video recording. But actually, there is a difference between someone taking a minute of a court case, even if it's publicly held, and someone recording it at a high level and disseminating it. And we do just need to have a think. It's for the courts and it's for other agencies to do, but we do need to think carefully now about how we capture data and how we transfer it, because there are consequences that we maybe didn't anticipate at the start. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much indeed.
John, if I can
Aaliya, please,
make a very, very quick point in terms of AI, and just remembering the focus of what I understood this discussion to be, that how are we using tech, access to justice for marginalised communities. I think the one thing I would say about AI is sometimes somebody has got a bracket of 5 minutes to try and get advice. And that 5 minutes is not going to be well utilised if they are going through a series of questions that they're trying to get an answer to. So where I started with saying, and completely agree with, there's nothing that's impossible, but there has to be that human element of being able to speak to an expert, particularly where your circumstances are such that you've only got a bracket of a few minutes to get advice. You need that person to be able to make the most of that few minutes that would then allow you to know what you need to do next. So I think we just need to bear that in mind, that it is not where you are using AI, there always needs to be, I need to speak to a human option to be there.
Thanks very much indeed. I think that's a really good point to wrap up with. So thank you for reminding us of it. And thank you so much to all of our speakers for such a rich sharing of what you've been doing. I want to make a very last minute plug that our next call next month, the link's in the chat. It's about how an organisation made 8 weeks of progress, or year's worth of progress in about 8 weeks. This recording will be on our YouTube channel, so go and have a look later if you find it really interesting. Let your colleagues know as well. And we're really grateful for not just the contributions from our speakers, but all the interesting questions as well. And I think it's been a really rich discussion this morning, so thanks all very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of your weeks. So,
Thanks, everyone.
thanks very much. Cheerio. Bye.
Thank you.